Well, in India, the academics perpetually disappoint the policymakers, so I don't see why today should be a different. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, Mr. Chairperson, all distinguished co-panelists, and the distinguished audience, ladies and gentlemen. I've been sort of trying to figure out how exactly one goes about this impossible geometry. This whole square circle business. And I thought that one way to do this, since I'm a useless academic, is to sort of not look at the 6 bilateral relationships that are embedded in these 4 states being juxtaposed in the same sentence, but try to sort of, in a way, look at other things, look at some of the other stuff, and hopefully some of the other stuff will make sense in the context of the bilateral relationships. Because to my mind, these are a complicated set of relationships for 5 reasons that are distinct yet in some ways interlocking. So let me just very briefly, first of all, tell you what I think these 5 reasons are. First, I think, is that we've got different levels of analysis at play here. In fact, some of these relationships are located at sort of the global and systemic levels, others at continental and regional levels. And I think that is, in some ways, to me at least, a core issue. And I'll spend some time talking about that. I think somewhere out there, we've got to deal with changing power differentials and differential growth rates. That's a core issue here. And it's an issue that I think in some ways we're going to try to have to get some sense of. And linked to that is the third sort of reason that I suggest sort of complicates this relationship. And that is that it's not really clear whether we're heading towards a power transition or really to system transformation. It isn't at all clear. And I think, that seems to me is a third reason why there's this real confusing geometry there. A fourth reason I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that there is a fair degree of uncertainty about the patterns of friendship and enmity in these bilateral relationships. In other words, there were a lot of certainties about each of these bilateral relationships, and I'd suggest to you that in each of them, all 6 of them, there actually have been very significant shifts of late. And of course, finally, it makes no sense to talk about all of this without focusing a little, at least, what's happening within these 4 countries. So in other words, there's uncertainty about the domestic dynamics. So that's a fair bit of stuff to do in, I think, the 13 minutes I have left. So I'll probably get cracking and spend about a couple of minutes on each of these points. This levels of analysis business, what does it mean? It's something that academics can't do without and policymakers absolutely loathe. And the reason is this. From a policymaking perspective, levels of analysis make no sense at all because it's an interconnected world. It's an interconnected system. Any perturbation at point A will have an impact invariably on points B, C, D, and E, and it's a job of policymakers or professional diplomats to figure that stuff out. But equally, from an academic perspective, levels of analysis are critical because you really can't do anything like reasonable analysis of world affairs without first trying to locate where the phenomenon lies principally. And thereby, once you have a sense about where a phenomenon actually is located, you can then go ahead and start to think about, well, how do you deal with the phenomenon? So if the level of analysis is purely domestic, if the issue is purely domestic, coming up with some international solution is not fundamentally going to help you. That's called, for example, democratization. You go and sort of impose something from the outside, and completely missing what the domestic dynamics are. That's just an example. And you can look at them all over the place, and you can see this confusion between where the phenomenon is principally located and the sorts of policy interventions we are choosing to make about them, or indeed the way we're trying to analyze them. Now, looked at it this way then, US-China clearly has systemic implications. Because, any which way this relationship works out is going to have an impact on the entire international system. US-India is perhaps tentatively systemic, but we're going to have to wait and see how that all pans out. India-China, I'll suggest to you, is today framed largely still in regional terms, But this is becoming continental very quickly and could be potentially global in its implications. Essentially, as I see it, China has outflanked India in South Asia. China has done so by being able to offer to all of India's neighbors an alternate incentive structure. Now, that alternate incentive structure basically goes like this. If you wish to benefit from the processes of globalization, you don't need to cohere to India. You can cohere with us. And get all those benefits that India could supposedly provide you. There's one additional advantage. We are never going to ever, in any conceivable circumstance, threaten your security. India, in some future circumstance, maybe even right today, might or is, depending on how you view it. So it's a very, very attractive proposition for all of India's neighbors. And it makes perfect sense why in each of those regional capitals, we see at the minimum a hedging strategy today vis-a-vis India. Now, how does India play the game? India plays the game vis-a-vis China then, and I suggest really by shifting to another level. It's got to start building its continental relationships. It's going to be the relationships with Jakarta and Canberra and Tokyo and Seoul, Singapore, go on with a couple of others, Hanoi, obviously. These are going to become some of the very critical relationships that India is going to have to play the India-China game at, which is what I meant when I said that this is a regional relationship that is already sort of in a way continental. And of course, it could end up having global implications. India-Pakistan, I'm not going to really say very much apart from stating the obvious. It is the cardinal bilateral relationship in the South Asian region. And it's a relationship that at the moment doesn't seem to be really going anywhere. And if it's really going anywhere, it seems to be heading south. What about changing power differentials and growth rates? Well, here's the thing. If you grow at even 7% per annum, your national income doubles every 10 years. And so a country like, of the continental size of China, if it manages to maintain its growth rates over a 3-decade period, it obviously has systemic impact. There's no question about it. India, much lower growth rates, but also a fairly sustained period of growth. There is no question about the fact that the United States is the preeminent power in the system at all. There can be no question about that. But when it comes to growth rates, the point is not so much about what your absolute capabilities are. The question is about what your capabilities are relative to the other states in the system. And that is where sort of these changes in global power balances take place over time. So, a simple example, Britain today is an infinitely more powerful and wealthy country than it was at the height of the Victorian era. A single Trident submarine has greater destructive power than all the dreadnoughts of the Royal Navy. But that's not the point, of course. The point is, what is British power today relative to the power of other states? So it's in that relative calculus where a lot of the real meat of the matter lies. And that's, I think, where Pakistan really perceives a growing window of vulnerability. Because the fact of the matter is that, the size of the Indian economy vis-a-vis the Pakistan economy is just going to keep growing. Unless there's some incredible turnaround, but that turnaround is going to have to be both ways. I mean, you're going to have to see India imploding, and you're going to have to see Pakistan suddenly going through this amazing renaissance. And you're going to have to see both happening simultaneously to really change that. And, at the moment, neither of them seems at all possible. I mean, however you may view India's sort of doddering growth rates at the moment, the fact is Pakistan's doing significantly worse and is likely to. So I think that's a second bunch of sorts of issues. One could go into this at great depth, and I've got a whole bunch of data here that I could read out, but that's boring stuff, and I really don't want to take a second more than the time allotted to me. The third core issue is about this question of power transition or system transformation. And very simply put, here's the question. Are we just going to be seeing over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years some new powers arise on the scene who are going to pretty much continue to conduct their external relationships and thereby world affairs pretty much as they have been done for the last 150 years? Or are we going to, in this process of these new actors coming on the scene, see something changing fundamentally? In other words, a transformation of the system itself. And there are plenty of drivers to suggest that we are probably going to see some form of system transformation, if nothing else, because there are issue areas arising today that didn't exist in the past, like the global ecosystem, the environment, which simply wasn't an issue in the past. So, I mean, it can't clearly be business as usual, simply because there are items on the active agenda today that didn't exist in the past. And we're going to have to come up with new ways of dealing with it. In one of the papers I've written, I've suggested, in fact, that all global problems really can be seen, can be categorized in three ways. We've got some sort of, global problems which are sort of, basically, in some ways, new problems, new issue areas, requiring, therefore, completely new forms of treatment. Then you've got a bunch of different problems where, you've got sort of old problems, but we're going to have to find new solutions for them. And then there are a third set of problems that are really old problems, old solutions. It's just that we have new actors. So I think in some ways, where this balance finally comes to lie is going to be a critical issue. And I'll just throw one little bit at you out here by getting a couple of other countries into this. The BRICS, for example. What are the BRICS about? I was fortunate to be in Durban in an academic forum just before this past BRICS summit, and it was interesting to see that, I think there was complete disagreement, and academics disagree anyway. We are utterly useless people, but it was interesting that the disagreements were not only between the various national groups, but within the national groups. About what exactly the BRICS are, what exactly they're about, where are they going, what are their implications. All of this is up in the air. And I think that's one of the core issues here. Is it just power transition, or is it something else? And I think in some ways, when we think about this square circle, we're going to have to get this issue into it. But I would have loved to say a bit more about this, but frankly, one needs to be disciplined about time in these sorts of, occasions, on these sorts of occasions. Well, the fourth kind of issue is this one about patterns of friendship and enmity. Now, clearly, friendship and enmity are those ideal types at two ends of a spectrum. In most relationships in the real world, whether they're individual relationships or corporate relationships or relationships between nations, are obviously not, very rarely on those extreme ends of the spectrum. They always sort of lie somewhere in between. But what's happening there? China-Pakistan is obviously an all-weather friendship, but for all long. I'm absolutely certain that I will not get a white flower. So, it's an all-weather friendship, but for how long? And is there going to be a redefinition of that relationship? Maybe in some weathers and not in others. For example, U.S.-China. Is it going to be G2, or is it going to be the containment of China? Or is it going to be third option that nobody talks about, but I think we need to start thinking about very seriously, which is steady Chinese inroads into areas that were traditionally in the US sphere of influence? Look at who's buying the real estate and what used to be the Panama Canal zone. And you begin to get an idea that, it's just to see this as G2 or the US containment of China is sort of treating China as an object and not as a state with its own policy-making abilities. US-Pakistan, well, it's an interesting relationship because currently Pakistan is a frontline state that is also seen by the US as a legitimate target. So it's both. It's a frontline state and a legitimate target. But what happens now? What happens sort of 2014? It's just around the corner. And obviously from Pakistan's point of view, they're going to try as long as they can to try to sort of balance their relations with the US and China, to sort of try to keep both of those relationships going. But there again, those systemic issues and pressures will at some stage, I think, begin to tell. I'm not going to say very much about US-India because, frankly, I'm sure others will, and I'd be happy to take that up in the Q&A. India-Pakistan, just one thought, which is this. Friendship with India is really not a winning proposition in Pakistan's domestic politics. which is not to say that there aren't some fairly positive views about India. But I'm not intimidated. You may be, sir, I'm not. Now, on this whole question, just another thought. It may sound provocative, but it's not being said to provoke, although it may, is this. India is essentially friendless in the international system today. I mean, and really has been so since 1991. India has friendly relations with many countries, but friendship in that sense of security backup with no country. And if you ever want to try to figure out what's this Indian obsession for strategic autonomy, it's very different today, this obsession with strategic autonomy, than the strategic autonomy of the non-alignment years. And that's the core difference, that India really is fundamentally friendless. But fortunately, it's friendless at a time when it is an emerging power, and so has the wherewithal in terms of capabilities to do a fair bit itself. Domestic dynamics. I'm just going to rattle this out now. Pakistan, the possibilities are on an incredibly wide spectrum, from democratic transition all the way to descent into societal chaos and a failed state. Frankly, take your pick. But I think all these points along the spectrum are serious possibilities in terms of Pakistan's future. And I think if we do actually see a democratic transition in Pakistan, I know the Indian reaction is going to be to point out, how completely flawed Pakistan is and its domestic politics, but I hope at least quietly, even if we don't articulate it, we feel happy about it. We feel happy about the fact that Pakistan has actually carried out successfully a democratic transition. I think it would be a very big day, and really should be a very big day for everybody in South Asia, if that happens. I'm not saying that was going to lead necessarily to a path of Pakistan becoming a society of civic virtue or anything like that. But we know what domestic politics is like in our own country. So when did democratic politics guarantee civic virtue? The United States faces extreme political polarization. In fact, the political philosopher, political psychologist, Jonathan Haidt actually suggests that there are, in some ways, these levels of polarization in US domestic politics are really back to the levels that existed immediately after the US Civil War. And there are really three reasons why we're unlikely to see this clock being turned back. Let me rattle these reasons out. The first is that the passing of the Second World War generation. The fact that these guys had fought in this war, what they considered a righteous war together, meant that they could build friendships across the aisle. And with the passing of the Second World War generation, you just simply don't have that any longer. Second, that era where you had three mainstream centrist TV channels, that the airwaves were dominated by these three channels. They were all basically coming up with the same points of view. They were all centrist points of view, and thereby shaping, the public mind. That's gone forever. And finally, there no longer are that very curious bridge that existed in US domestic politics, which was Northwestern Republicans on the one hand and Southern Democrats on the other. And Northwestern Republicans and Southern Democrats could cohabit very easily, and thereby provide a bridge for the extremes of their own political parties. But both of them are really extinct species now. And so there really isn't a bridge. And therefore, we may not be seeing, merely a moment in US history, and, we may be actually seeing really a very new era where the United States becomes really, really hopelessly polarized between two political extremes that really begin to view each other as enemies, that have completely different understandings of what the core issues in the public life of their country are. And if that were to happen, that's, I think, going to be a really, really major problem in terms of how the United States is going to make policy, whether domestic or international. China, will this generation of the Chinese leadership inaugurate a decade of reform and political liberalization, which they might, or will they fail to do so and leave behind these huge, almost tectonic pressures for a next generation of leadership to tackle? That's the core issue as far as China's domestic politics is concerned, as I see it. India, ...